Stop the presses, folks! Stop the presses! The new AlphaTauri logo's been leaked! And it's pretty nice. According to Decal Spotters and Fastest Pit Stop, Red Bull actually trademarked the term Racing Bulls earlier this year, and if this is true, it's not bad. There were ruminations about the team being named after a potential sponsor like Hugo Boss or Adidas, so it'd have been Adidas Bulls Racing or Hugo Boss Bulls Racing or something like that, but Racing Bulls? That's a pretty good name, and it's very much making it clear that this team is going to be very similar to the Red Bull main team. Pretty much the same arrangement that we saw with Toro Rosso. This logo, I quite like, and this black and white color scheme does make sense because we saw a little nod to it in Las Vegas with that really interesting streak design, and I feel like it could work if Adidas and Hugo Boss were major sponsors of the car or part of the name, because those logos do work in black and or white. And I feel like this could be a really good indicator that this logo is probably legit. But I still find it really weird that we're seeing different letters with the Red Bull font, but it's a really authentic logo. It does make a lot of sense. It's a nice little variation. It does differ enough from the main Red Bull Racing logo. I quite like it. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Even though Abu Dhabi is the final race of the season and the driver and constructors titles have been sewn up, there are things to fight for coming into this race. Maybe not Toto spoiling for a fight with Michael Massey again after that little dig in the press conferences on Monday. Oh dear, he just cannot let that go, can he? But of course, there is P2 to fight for, there's 4th to fight for, and 7th to fight for. But first, my boy Mick got a job! Alpine have just confirmed his role as part of their hypercar campaign for the 2024 WEC season, the A424 gaining some interest in testing, and not just because of those really mint-looking rear lights are the Alpine A. Oh, they're gorgeous. Bruno Famin, the VP of Alpine Motorsport and one of the major figureheads of the Alpine F1 team currently as they're going through a transitional phase of redevelopment, valued Mick's work ethic and commitment primarily out of everything else that they saw in the testing. And that does make sense because it's my firm belief that Mick's commitment in the simulator, working long into the night, is what was responsible partly in getting that team a double podium at the Circuit de Catalunya. And I think they also value Mick's time in the midst of adversity and building a team up because of the situation with Haas, because he was dealing with a lot back then. That probably has made him a lot more determined than before. And just save the crash comments, please. And he didn't crash during the test, let's just say that. And yes, he'll still be the reserve driver for Mercedes and probably McLaren as well, but with McLaren you have no idea. They've got so many drivers. For all we know, we might see Bianca Bustamante in an FP1 session or something like that. I don't know. Anything could happen. But we are getting Pato Award for FP1. But either way, Mick Schumacher getting a job, a full-time racing seat next season. Brilliant. I'm now going to be starting to watch WEC. I think if he does well this season, we might see him slip into Alpine for 2025 because both drivers' contracts there are up. You can watch this video for my in-depth thesis regarding this arrangement, but I am certainly thrilled and I will be definitely watching his career with great interest. Who do I think is going to win? Well, I think it's obviously going to be Max. I don't think anyone's going to be troubling him taking the top spot. I think that's pretty much a foregone conclusion. Red Bull have historically done well here, ever since 2020 especially. So I'm really thinking there's not going to be any major upsets unless there's some kind of DNF due to a mechanical issue, because we are getting very close to the end of the season and parts are getting more and more worn out, and we haven't really seen that many DNFs or grid penalties concerning parts wearing out and they have to replace them. We might see more and more of that happening at this particular race. Ferrari, in their battle for second place with Mercedes, might be the most vulnerable. That situation in Vegas, them having to replace parts, means they absolutely cannot waste any more parts. They cannot have any crashes, they cannot have any mechanical faults. They are going to be on a knife edge against Mercedes. There's only 4 points between them for the battle for second, and I personally think that Ferrari might just do it, but it's all down to whether or not the car can last the distance. If we see a grid penalty from either one of them, Mercedes could do well enough to keep them behind, because Mercedes, up until they had their own maladies last year, were pretty solid. The only thing that stopped George Russell from doing well was the fact he had a slow pit stop, and then, because of an unsafe release, got a 5-second penalty, which kept him to the lower end of the top 10. Hamilton was almost on course for third, and then he had a hydraulic problem, which is also something that could affect them as well. It could affect any team, a DNF, or them losing positions. So that battle is almost too close to call, but I think at this situation, Ferrari might decide to either go extremely cautious, or just go, okay, we got nothing to lose, let's just go for it. Let's just go hell for leather. But neither team is going to be stopping Red Bull for having one of the most dominant seasons of F1 since 1988. And yes, I know, McLaren equally had a dominant season, winning every single race bar one, which is the same thing that happened in Red Bull. And I find it really amusing that in both occasions, Ferrari were the fly in the ointment. But I think Carlos Sainz will be the better Ferrari driver out of the two because he's got his own little battle. He is currently 4th in the driver's standings. Yes, Lewis Hamilton is safe in 3rd place. No one's going to be challenging him. He is the best of the rest, which is something Mercedes really need to take stock with. They are still the best of the rest. Is that still not good enough? But either way, Carlos is going to be the runner-up of the best of the rest, which is good enough for them. But Alonso is there too, and is only 5th due to countback because Sainz got that win in Singapore. For the last few races, ever since Qatar, both teams were having problems either through penalties or accidents or mistakes or mechanical issues that limited each team from scoring major points against the other one. Las Vegas changed all of that, with Ferrari gaining considerably more points than Mercedes because Hamilton had a bad qualifying, he could only get up to 7th, and George was looking odds on to getting 4th place. Then he had that tangle with Max, got the 5-second penalty, that kept him to 8th, and you just feel like, oh, Mercedes made it so much harder for themselves. If they hadn't had that, they probably would have had just enough to breathe a little bit easier, but Ferrari, they're right on their tail. And they're going for it. But that fragility from Ferrari might come back to haunt them, you never know, which is making this all the more exciting. Meanwhile, McLaren and Aston are busy doing their own thing in the battle for 4th in the Constructors. And that place is very, very intriguing because we all thought a couple of races ago that McLaren were a shoo-in for getting 4th place due to their massive return to form from the Silverstone Grand Prix and technically Austria onwards. But the last couple of races have been a little bit iffy, because Oscar Piastri had a few races where he wasn't really doing much. In Brazil, that was beyond his control due to that weird lap technicality. So it meant that he really couldn't do much and he couldn't really score points. He was mainly there just to help out Lando in his battle for 2nd place, ultimately. At that same time, Lance Stroll decided to finally show up and get 2 top 5 finishes in a row, gaining 20 points that were valuable as Fernando Alonso excelled in Brazil and made a silly mistake in Las Vegas, but Lance Stroll was there to help pick up the pieces, which is something to commend. The Stroll is definitely in the headlines in a negative-ish way, and it's not Lance this time, it's Papa Stroll. He's causing a stink amongst the world of F1, and it's mostly down to CO2. Aston had made a big commitment to reducing emissions from its operation in time for F1's Net Zero 2030 campaign, and yet its owner took over 1,500 flights since the start of 2022, as reported by The Guardian, and a fair chunk of those flights lasted less than a quarter of an hour. There's not even enough time in the air to serve out the hors d'oeuvres. This report talks about other celebrities and oligarchs as well. He isn't the only one, but he is one of the major offenders in this particular investigation. And why did I decide to bring it up? Well, it's down to the fact that recently Aston Martin got a 3-star rating from the FIA in terms of its efforts towards environmental stability. So the juxtaposition is completely ridiculous. That's why I wanted to bring it up. It's just like, oh my God, Papa Stroll, you are not listening to your own team. Are private jets just that important to you? I mean, I don't even get it. And yes, I know, other drivers have private jets of their own. Max Verstappen famously has one bedecked in red and black with his logo on the tail. Yes, that does happen. And it doesn't stop there either, because I'm getting a feeling of it begins. Because Aston Martin have sold a chunk of itself to an outside investor. The first time that Lawrence Stroll has done that. The outfit in question being Arctos Partners, which values the team at over $1 billion with their minority investment. Don't Aramco own a part of the team? Well, no actually. They're just more of a major sponsor with the naming rights to the team on the entry. Now you might be thinking that this is shocking, but really, it's nothing new. Alpine sold an even bigger chunk of itself to multiple celebrities for a dinner table topic for them, and Mercedes is owned partially by Ineos, and many other teams are small stakes owned by outside companies, including McLaren. But this to me is quite significant for the fact that Papa Stroll has relinquished partial control of his team. He might not necessarily be the only one anymore calling the shots, because now we are having a significant stakeholder in the Aston Martin F1 team. They will have an input in the direction of that team and where it goes. And that might lead into the question of the future of Lance Stroll. Sure, right now, he has been able to deliver the goods and get some good points finishes. But might that be a false dawn? If this turns out just to be a flash-in-the-pan performance, as we have expected from Lance Stroll over the years, he does have good moments, followed by really long drought periods, might this put some pressure on him to finally be moved along, maybe to the WEC campaign for Aston Martin in 2025, because there might be pressure, real pressure, from outside investors. This is something that I find really intriguing, and it did fly under the radar for quite a few people. This might be the beginning of Lawrence Stroll maybe starting to sell off bits of the team, the F1 team, to outside investors to try and make some money back due to all of the investment he's put into the Silverstone operation and the factory. That is perfectly viable to try and sustain the team to make sure that they can keep their trajectory going with their 5-year plan, which is working out well so far. It is interesting because Papa Stroll likes total control. Now he doesn't have that. Watch this space, folks. Now, I would talk about the battle for 7th because between those 4 teams, it is pretty intriguing, but it was kind of dampened a little bit in Vegas because none of those teams scored. So I'll leave it to this video to discuss the major topics on how Daniel Ricciardo cost Haas $10 million by relegating them down to last. And Haas couldn't even score points when resorting to litigation in Austin. Unless Haas pulls a blinder and somehow scores 17 points in one race and nobody else scores in the bottom 4. P2 for Hulkenberg, perhaps? But there is also a matter of paying attention, for once, to the free practice sessions. Now, many people don't really pay much attention to them because the times aren't really representative. The teams are trying to find their feet, and McLaren in particular, they are relatively anonymous in FP1, so we usually see them at the back and then suddenly they do really well in the race and qualifying, and sometimes FP3 as we saw with Piastri in Vegas. But this time around, these teams are going to be bringing out some experimental 2024 parts since the regulations are basically the same for next year. And the FIA does allow this so long as those parts do not go on to be raced for qualifying and on Sunday. You can do that and not tell anybody what parts are being used. Some things might come to light in the media, but you can run anything you want so long as it is technically within the rules and regulations, which is something that Red Bull did do in Singapore with a brand new floor concept, and Alpine did in Las Vegas last time out. What parts were they? They were very small experimental parts, but Alpine seemed to get a good amount of information. So I wouldn't be surprised by some really unusual lap times. They may be not representative of the team. They don't want to show their hand right now, not even before the young driver test. Now, speaking of young drivers, there will be many of them out in Abu Dhabi because the teams have to. They're in the situation of going like, oh, we've only got one race left, we got to fill in with young drivers. Just put them in there, because Red Bull are filling in both of their seats with their young drivers from their driver program. Pato O'Ward gets to ride in anger for McLaren, and Vesty gets another chance with Mercedes. Hopefully they'll allow him to push, unlike in Mexico, where he was basically a mule for race setup and he didn't really get a good representative time. All the other drivers in Mexico got to have a little go on soft tyres, Vesty didn't, and that made him look really slow. Hopefully, he can have a go properly and show his real speed, especially with Kimi Antonelli waiting in the wings in F2. He might be usurped, Frederick. Teo Porcher might get to actually drive the Alfa Romeo car, even though it's really not worth speaking of, but hey, he is leading the F2 championship, so he should deserve a proper go. And then Ollie Behrman is back in the Haas again, and I'm really excited to see what he can do, because he's a very punchy driver, and I think he would fit in really, really well at Haas. Who knows? Many people in the comments have been suggesting that Esteban Ocon might be a good fit for Haas in 2025, if Hulkenberg goes to Sauber and Kevin decides to bow out, so Ocon-Behrman lineup? That's actually pretty interesting. So when you consider that other teams are going to be testing out experimental parts as well as having young drivers in there, I wouldn't be surprised if the times are even less representative, because you're going to have young newbie drivers and then experimental parts. So it'll be very, very intriguing to see what they can come up with. I would definitely tune in before the winter break comes in, and then we'll have no idea what to do. Well, I know what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be celebrating, because I reached my personal goal of 25,000 subscribers before the Abu Dhabi race ended and the season ended as well. And I'm really, really happy to see that. Thank you all so much for being here and listening to the ramblings of the F1 ladder man. You can help celebrate by maybe taking a look at the LawVS store, representing the LawVS posse going into the 2024 season. And let me know in the comments if there's any type of merch missing or particular colours that you might like to see. Maybe a Lando Prime shirt, perhaps? But okay. For the last time this season, let's get to the predictions. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you that, of course, this is going to be a Red Bull 1-2. Max Verstappen first, Sergio Perez second, like it was last year. I really don't see any issue for Red Bull because they like this racetrack a lot, and not just because of the obvious reason from 2 years ago. They were mighty in 2020. There's something about this track that they just gel with. I feel like Sergio Perez will have another solid race and build on the momentum that he got from Brazil and Las Vegas. Many people were quite quick to dig on him still because he should have kept ahead of Charles Leclerc, but again, that rear wing he had limited his speed down the straight, and it was very clear that if you didn't have the speed down the straight, you were a sitting duck. So for him to be at one point leading that race, that's still pretty good, and expectations have to be managed. Who's going to be third out of the Ferraris or Mercedes? Well, I think it's going to be very close, but Carlos Sainz will just edge out Lewis Hamilton third place, Lewis taking fourth. Carlos Sainz will be on a mission here to make up for lost ground in Vegas and also cement his place in fourth place in the driver's standings, getting his best position of the season, and going 2 for 1 in the battle against Charles Leclerc for the most scoringest member of the Ferrari team. Carlos also has a good track record at this circuit as well, but Charles Leclerc does as well, so I'm really a little bit precarious with this prediction, but I think in this situation, when the pressure comes down to it, Carlos Sainz will prosper. But Lewis Hamilton will be giving him good chase because he is good here as well, and will also want to have another repeat of the battles he had with Carlos last year because they were trading places considerably at the beginning portion of that race. So I think we might see that again, but Carlos will just about squeeze him out because that Ferrari is steadily progressing. But maybe a little bit of a collision between them might jeopardize that entirely, and Charles Leclerc can pick up the pieces. Who knows? But I think Charles will pick up 5th place because George Russell, even though he did put in a really good performance in Las Vegas, save for that little coming together with Max Verstappen, he managed to make up for lost time and that little argy-bargy and that 5-second penalty to get 4th place on the road. But I don't think he will be troubling the top 5 here. But I could easily be wrong. These are only predictions, folks. But they have been really fun to share with you. So as we wrap up the 2023 F1 season and the driver standings are essentially sewn up save for a couple of positions, do you want to have a little bit of a laugh and see how wrong I might have been when predicting the driver standings? You can go and watch this video next to see what I predicted at the beginning of the 2023 season and how it stacks up with what we're seeing before Abu Dhabi. What was I thinking?